He sprinted through the darkening neighborhood, scared of what his little boy was doing out so late. He'd gotten reports about him going to the cemetery for months, but didn't think much of it. But after what his neighbor shared with him that evening, he knew he needed to get to his son fast or lose him. But what he'd discover would leave him shaking all over. Sadly, this wasn't the first thing to go sideways that year for Frank Sallow. Now a single dad taking care of his 7-year-old son, he was trying his best to keep his head above water. But everything seemed to be falling out of place. From little Jeremy's unexplained visits to the grave, to Frank's personal life crashing down on him, he didn't know that the worst was yet to come. Frank was like any other 40-year-old dad in Kansas. He was proud of what he'd achieved in life, from his booming plumbing business and wonderful home, to his beloved wife Sarah, who had made him the happiest man by giving him a son, Jeremy. Life had been great for their little family. Well, that's until trouble came knocking. Jeremy, who had been born a healthy baby, suddenly fell sick. Frank and Sarah were beside themselves with worry, rushing the little angel to the emergency room. They hoped the issue wasn't severe, thinking it was a bad stomachache, but one look at the doctor's face as he hurried down the hall to talk to them, and they knew the news wasn't pleasant. The doctor shared his findings, telling Frank and Sarah that their kid had chronic kidney failure. The news came as a gut punch, hitting Frank and leaving him reeling where he stood. He took a deep breath to steady himself, watching as Sarah talked to the doctor. Her head was held high and her arms crossed above her chest as she spoke. Frank couldn't believe how lucky he was. Sarah had always been a strong woman. Her skin and will were made of steel. Her emotions as unwavering as the noon sun. Even in the face of such heartbreaking news, she was trying to find a way out, exploring options for Jeremy. The doctor shared that kidney failure in kids is usually hard to pinpoint. This is because the symptoms typically start showing when the kidney has lost 80% of its function. So what could the Sallows do? The doctor informed them that he'd already put Jeremy on a waiting list since his condition was dire. Both of the boy's kidneys were failing. He didn't have much time, but by some unexplained miracle, the family found a suitable match, and Jeremy underwent surgery to fix his condition. Even the doctors were impressed by the sudden development. Everything was slowly getting back to normal when disaster struck again. 3 months passed when everything fell apart. Frank had been at work near the town lake, assessing a new building in town that needed a sewage system installed. The day was going great until his phone rang. Pulling it out, he grinned when he saw Sarah's name on the screen, but his smile would fade as soon as he answered the call. Frank pressed the phone against his ear, thinking his wife was missing him and wanted to talk. She'd been doing a lot of that lately, calling him at odd hours of the day or waking him up late at night to hold conversations. Although he initially found it strange, he'd quickly fallen in love with this new side of her. He could spend hours listening to her voice and laugh, relishing in her thoughts and helping solve her troubles. He had no idea what was truly happening. "Hi, honey," Frank answered, his lips curling as he set aside his work tools, ready to talk to the love of his life. "Frank," Sarah stammered in a broken voice, seemingly holding back a retch. "Something's wrong." Frank thought she was joking, role-playing as she liked to call it. He giggled, about to play along, but she coughed and hurled. "Something's terribly wrong. I need help. Please come home." Frank was already in his truck before Sarah could get the rest of that sentence out. He stepped on the gas, unsure of what was going on. Since it was the middle of the week, Jeremy was still at school, meaning Sarah was home alone. Frank had never driven so recklessly in his life. Today would be a first. But although he reached home in time, finding Sarah bent over the toilet, he wouldn't do much to help. She was throwing up blood and complaining about sharp pains in her lower abdomen. Frank wasted no time strapping her onto the passenger seat and driving to the emergency room. He waited quietly as the doctors tended to her, wondering in silence, has someone cursed my family? Although Frank hated to admit it, he was suspicious about why Sarah suddenly fell sick. He called one of his neighbors, a wonderful elderly woman called Mrs. Letitia, to take care of Jeremy until he returned in the morning. Sarah stayed in the emergency room for hours, the doctors doing their best to stabilize her condition. The first thing she asked for when she came to was to see her family. Frank frantically drove home to pick up Jeremy. It was already dark out, the hour leaning toward midnight. But on his way to the hospital, his phone started ringing insistently. It was one of the doctors who'd helped stabilize Sarah, saying she wanted to talk to Frank. She could barely get her words through as she told him how much he and Jeremy meant to her. Before the room's commotion ate her voice, she said one thing. "I did it for him, Frank." for our boy, Sarah whispered as machines beeped in the background and nurses hurled orders at each other. We're losing her, one said. Calling in the doctor, another yelled. Don't let him forget how special he is to me, Sarah stammered. You too, she added. Don't forget how special you are to me. I love you. And then the line died. Frank would break traffic rules for the third time that day, but he wouldn't reach Sarah on time. The days that followed were dark, empty, and meaningless for him. After laying Sarah to rest at the local cemetery, he canceled all his work appointments and stayed indoors. He became a shell of his former self, drowning out his sorrow with alcohol. He still couldn't wrap his head around what had just happened. As days turned into weeks, Frank Sallow deteriorated in his house. He lost interest in the things that once made his heart flutter. He even forgot to be a dad. And for the next few months, his neighbor, the sweet old Mrs. Letitia, had to take over Jeremy's affairs. Frank knew the pain would never end. Was there any reason to continue living without Sarah? How could she leave him like this? He had no clue that everything was about to change. Frank had stayed locked in his house for 6 months, sitting in his room with Sarah's wedding photo in his hands. He and Jeremy were living off his savings for the majority of this time. But one evening, the 7-year-old came to him, sadness burning in his young eyes. He had a book in his hand as he gently knocked on the door. What he said next snapped Frank back to reality. Mrs. Letitia is away for the evening, Dad. Can you help me with my math homework? The request left Frank speechless. He stared at his son, then at the wedding photo in his hands. He stood up, catching a glimpse of himself in the bathroom mirror. He ate back a cry as he realized how shabby he looked. How long had he been like this? How long had he forgotten to be a dad? Oh, Jer, he said, come here. Jeremy ran to his dad, and Frank scooped him into a tight hug. He couldn't say how sorry he was for not being there for him for the last few months. He couldn't even tell how many months had passed since they'd lost Sarah. He spent that night cutting his messy hair and beard and cleaning the house. He helped Jeremy with homework, cooked lasagna, and put on their favorite family movie. He hoped he'd make amends for not being there for him, but he was a little bit too late. Mrs. Letitia, who had been helping keep order in Frank's house for the last 6 months, was delighted to see him return to form. Everyone in the neighborhood came in to say hi, lamenting how they suffered without his plumbing expertise. Things were starting to look up for Frank, until Mrs. Letitia came to see him one fateful night. She'd tell him what her son had been doing over the last few months. I've been taking him to Sarah's grave, Mrs. Letitia began. She explained how torn Jeremy was after losing his mom. At such a young age, his grasp on death was still limited. He couldn't even believe that his mom was 6 feet under the iris and daffodil bushes at the cemetery. But with Mrs. Letitia's help, everything was becoming clearer. But this was only the first part of her confession. Over the last few days, Jeremy had been sneaking off to the cemetery by himself. Frank didn't think much of it when Letitia relayed the information. Theirs was a safe community where everyone knew everyone. He was sure his neighbors were keeping an eye out for the boy. But the second part of Mrs. Letitia's revelation left him worried. Yesterday he came to see me, Mrs. Letitia said worriedly. He does that sometimes, she added quickly and with an unsteady smile, but this time it was different. He said he met someone at the cemetery, a friend. Mrs. Letitia explained that few people usually visited the cemetery, which is why she was worried. But that wasn't all. She'd spent some time asking Jeremy about his new friend, but the boy didn't divulge much information. He only said his friend was almost his age and had been sick, just like Jeremy some 7 months earlier. Jeremy loved talking to her at the cemetery whenever he visited his mom. I followed Jeremy today, Mrs. Letitia said as her eyes ran wet. I didn't see his friend. Oh, Frank, I think something bad might be happening there. We need to stop it before it's too late. Mrs. Letitia had long been known as a superstitious woman. With roots in Eastern Europe and the Caribbean, she was a very spiritual person. Hearing her speak and listening to her take on what was happening reminded Frank of what Sarah had said before passing. I did it for him, Frank, she said, for our boy. Frank thought she was only rumbling at the time due to heavy medication, but now his heart began thumping in his ears. What if Mrs. Letitia was right and something terrible was happening? How many times had Frank heard the stories about people giving up themselves for their loved ones? He remembered how, out of the blue, a donor had appeared with a kidney for Jeremy. He recalled how thankful Sarah had been. He also thought back to what she did afterward and how disturbed it had left him. "I did it for him, Frank." The once comforting but now cold words replayed in his mind. He took a deep breath, rubbing a hand down his sweaty face. Could he reveal Sarah's words to Mrs. Letitia? But he couldn't let his mind walk a path rife with superstition. He thanked her for letting him know about Jeremy's activities and promised to look into it. A few days passed, with Jeremy visiting his mom's grave daily. As much as Frank tried to ignore it, suspicions were growing in him. Then, one evening, Mrs. Letitia came bursting through his kitchen door. "I've seen him riding to the cemetery," she almost screamed. "Please go after him, Mr. Sallow." Frank didn't need to be told twice. The first thing Frank saw when he got to the cemetery was Jeremy's bike parked near the gate. He dashed inside and, true to Mrs. Letitia's word, found his son standing over Sarah's grave. But Jeremy wasn't alone. Standing next to him was a blonde-haired girl that Frank immediately recognized. He'd met her parents a few weeks after Jeremy's kidney surgery. Everything suddenly made sense. The hospital had diagnosed the girl with liver failure, and Sarah, thankful for the donor who saved her son's life, stepped up. She took some tests to see if she was a match for her. As it turned out, she was. The doctors set up for the surgery, helping her donate part of her liver to save the girl. From the corner of his eye, Frank saw the girl's parents waiting for her at the edge of the cemetery. He'd seen them at Sarah's funeral, but was too distraught to even say hi. He exhaled, knowing he was still far from uncovering this mystery.